Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm joined again by Keith Preston, Aleksey, and Florian. Today's episode 101 of the Roundtable, How Technology Undermines Community and Identity. So I think as a helpful starter, we might want to talk about what are the sort of things that need to be in place to have community and identity. So the first thing, and this is a non-exhaustive list, but these are just a few things that I thought of before the show. The first thing is that you need for a community is proximity. If you can't walk to each other's houses, then you can't really have a community. And Aristotle comments on this in Nicomachean Ethics about friendship. He says you can't really be friends with someone unless you are within walking distance. And that's further emphasized with the proverb, you cannot be someone's friend unless you consume salt together, which is a euphemism for eating because you need to salt your food and also preserve it. Back then you didn't have refrigerators. Similar points of view. Aristotle said you can't be a friend with someone who's radically different than you. You know, he would have thought it would have been impossible for a Greek to be friend with a barbarian, unless the barbarian was so highly educated or Hellenized or something. You know, that's maybe not a hard limit, but it's certainly a limit. And then also kinship. You're more likely to have community relations with someone who you grew up with, who's related to you. That's not to say you can't build synthetic communities, and there were in the past, like say a monastery or a university, but what those synthetic communities themselves existed upon a sort of sea of organic communities, i.e., based on filial relationships rather than some sort of shared abstract belief system, like religious piety of the monk or scholarship of the university professor. And then we have identity. Now, identity is formed in the past, one, by your environment, where you grow up. So part of that would be if you grew up in a wooded environment, then you would learn how to hunt, you learn how to track, you learn how to avoid being seen by predators. Throughout all of human history until 30 years ago, you were either male or female. You had a fixed sex. Ethnicity. You were born into a tribe with a certain set of values and identities. And then you had a religion and or philosophy. So it's just sort of like the community that you grew up in had certain beliefs that you were expected to go along with. So we can broadly say that with regards to community and an individual identity, we have three factors: social, environmental, and mental. So social would include, your sex, who you relate to, and how you relate to them. Proximity, and then environment. So conditions would be broadly environment, and then religion and philosophy would be like mental. All three of those are undercut by technology. So, for example, the automobile undercuts proximity. You can just drive wherever you want. You don't need to stick around with anyone if you don't want to. And so it creates the cost of exiting a community becomes very low. Whereas in the past, it was generally very high, unless you were some sort of an equestrian, in which case you just jump on your horse and go away. So that's a downward pressure on community formation. Also, what happens is environment, right? Especially even prior to modern technology, the idea that living in an urban environment was harmful. It was seen even by the Romans. So at the end of the Republic, many of the old conservative class of Romans were like, well, if you lose your connection to the land, you lose something fundamental. And it creates this unreality machine living in a city. And we've only accelerated that ad nauseum. So now the environment that we're living in is not itself an organic environment. It's one that's synthetic and created, and it's sort of overlaid all over the world now. So we relate to that rather than to, say, the rivers, the trees, and the land itself, which creates a very different set of dynamics in order to live with and relate to. You can then also form all sorts of communities that are not based on ethnicity or kinship. So it's very easy now to do that. And so the exit cost for leaving something like that is very low, and the cost for keeping people, in is high. So in a way, this just would not have been possible before, because ultimately what matters more now, the question is still how do you get resources, but whether it's capitalism versus communism, you have to interact. It's not horizontal side to side, it's vertical up and down. You've got to go up to some sort of mechanical process that provides you with food or clothes or housing, rather than horizontally with friends and family and the people that you grew up with. And so because of these pressures, you're now going upwards rather than sideways, which also has an effect of undermining community and identity. And furthermore, with especially with beginning with film, but also specifically accelerated with digital technology, like on the internet, video games, and AI art and everything like that, you can create a galaxy of completely impossible realities that people believe could be true because they saw it on a screen. But that's not real, right? But we've been conditioned to believe that it is, because if something's been filmed, that's real. So we just kind of extend that out into this like fantasy land. So rather than being educated by your peers or by your family or by a religious leadership, you're sort of having your world formed by these abstract images, which leads you to expect things that you would otherwise have no reason to expect. With social media and you browsing history on the internet, you can basically, with the algorithm, create a completely hermetically sealed reality where you only see what you want to see or what you expect to see, and can shut everything out completely. That's getting harder and harder now as people become more and more atomized, which is actually leading to mental health issues. So, but ultimately what technology does fundamentally, if you want to go abstract all the way, is that it takes identity and community or originate in organic processes that exist. Technology is a synthetic process which seeks to impose itself over, on, and above these things. Now, I argue that it can't do this forever, but it's doing it now. And in so doing, it is erasing all of the sort of toe. Imagine you're climbing a wall, like someone and you have these toe holds. It's erasing all the toe holds so that you have nowhere to climb up. You lose connection with what came before. And it just so happens that organic lived experience of reality is what's a precondition for community formation in the first place. Aleksey.
Fundamental question here is whether the our access to technology makes it impossible for us to form new connections. And I would say the answer to that is no, it's not impossible, but it certainly is much more difficult. In Ball and Alone, Robert Putnam discussed how technology leads us to focus on really two kinds of social connections: business and of course very close connections. And this is a fundamental question. If technology allows us to do what we want, that is stay close to our friends and family by calling them every day, or having voice chats, video chats, and so on, and to connect with people who are in business with us, or people that we really want to see, what's so bad about this? After all, is it not our fault and not the fault of technology if we do what we want to do and then we're not happy with the results? So Fyodor Dostoevsky had in fact written about this extensively, both in Brothers Karamazov and in Notes from the Underground. In Brothers Karamazov, he has a character named Ivan Karamazov, who was a rational thinker, a skeptic, and an atheist. And in Dostoevsky's mind, this is a representation of progress in a way. Karamazov represented anarchists, socialists, and other progressives whom Dostoevsky opposed. Although, of course, Karamazov is perhaps not a terrorist in the way some progressives were in Russia at the time. Yet the problem with Karamazov is that his pursuit of rationality essentially led him to nihilism. That Ivan Karamazov succumbed to the illness. He was visited by Satan, and that's a metaphor how he literally drove himself crazy. And the Notes from the Underground, the narrator has a very similar experience. That this is a very bitter, misanthropic old man who's a government bureaucrat. And he talks about how his isolation has also driven him insane. That he talks about how in his sea of bitterness that he was lost in, he ended up desiring misery for others, how he would use his position as a bureaucrat to complicate life for others. And what are these two characters in Dostoevsky's novels have in common? What they have in common is simple, that in both cases, a very progressive view of the world led them to self-sequester from other influences that may be undesirable. For example, Ivan Karamazov and the Karamazov brothers dismissed the guidance from his little brother, Alyosha, who was in fact religious, a bit saintly and naive. That Ivan Karamazov decided to become a skeptical, cynical, and hard-nosed figure who only trusted his own faculty of reason and nothing more. This in Dostoevsky's view is a manifestation of the disastrous consequences of rationalism. Now, fast forward 150 years to where we are now. What do we see with Robert Putnam's Ball and Alone? Well, Putnam drove the point home that now we are no longer putting in the effort to interact with our neighbors who may not be so similar to us, who may see the world differently. Now we're segregating based on interests. We're self-segregating, and we're avoiding opportunities. We're forfeiting opportunities for growth by having deep interpersonal communications with people who may see the world in a radically different way. Todd, as you said, it's often difficult to form relationships with people who are radically different. Of course, when you're talking about people who don't even speak the same language, who have nothing in common with you at all, that may be impossible. But we keep on setting the bar way too high for our standards. The more subsumed we become into the world of technology, the more demanding we become of the people around us, the more likely we are to say that this person is just way too different, that we're not even trying to find common ground with them. But had technology not been such an integral part of our lives, I think we would have put more effort into finding connections with people who may be difficult to relate to at times, but not impossible. So, as we see in the case of progress and progressivism in the 19th century with Russia, that had Ivan Karamazov been a little bit more humble, maybe he would have been more receptive to his little brother's guidance, spiritual guidance. Maybe he would have been more open to the spiritual aspects of the community around him. For example, in that same novel, Starets Zosima, Father Zosima, was also a figurehead for the religious element, for the way religion creates a sense of community. And of course, Ivan Karamazov had legitimate criticisms of religion, as did all progressives. They've shut the door on the way it may open up opportunities for creating a community. Now that we live in 2020, not 2000, as in the case of Robert Putnam, the situation is much worse. It's much more extreme. So if we fast forward just 8 years from the publication of Robert Putnam's Ball and Alone, where he first sounded the alarm on the isolating effects of technology in our community, we will see the publication of The Big Sword by Bill Bishop. And there Bill Bishop traced the influence, traced the development of self-segregating tendencies that he saw in the 90s to the modern day of his time, 2008. In the 1990s, Bishop noticed that the era of prosperity, which was largely ushered in by technology and the economic policy of the free markets, people began to self-segregate radically. Excuse me.
Well, okay.
Sorry about that. All right. So, and as a result of this, people began to sort themselves into communities that are not only ethnically homogeneous, but also very similar in terms of class and viewpoint, where there was little to no viewpoint diversity. Now, if you fast forward another 10 years, you will see the same phenomenon, which is much more extreme. After 2014, we've had what is now known as the Great Awakening, which was championed by the Obama administration. And this, to me, served the purpose of further self-segregating people in a way that creates a community of very like-minded people. For instance, before Obama's second term, the most ethnic, the most ideologically homogeneous people may have been the religious communities. And the most ideologically homogeneous of these religious communities may have been a sect, like, say, Jehovah's Witnesses or certain denominations of Mormons. Yet no, after the second Obama term, we saw the Great Awakening in 2014, where the secular liberal groups have pursued their narrowly defined agendas with even greater missionary zeal. For instance, it's become common for liberals to excommunicate other leftists because of fairly trivial differences. Say the Hobby Lobby question: should your employer pay shouldn't a woman's employer pay for your contraceptives? And if you don't agree with a liberal on any given point on that, well, then you need to find a different place to practice your political affiliation, or you need to find a different place to find like-minded people. Since then, you fast forward another 8 years, you find another 6 years, you get 2020, the pandemic, where the use of technology has even increased further. During the pandemic, it has become even less possible for us to go to any sort of a meetup where we would find a person with even a slightly different point of view. It was actually illegal in many cases. So we began to delve further down the rabbit hole of obsession with technology and artificial social media groups. The result was predictable, much like what happened with the protagonist in the Notes from the Underground and Ivan Karamazov in Brothers Karamazov. The insanity epidemic has utterly consumed America. We've seen it. We see today Gen Z bore the brunt of these developments. If there was anybody who could possibly represent Ivan Karamazov today, it's got to be an intelligent and articulate Gen Z university graduate who may actually be academically gifted, who lacks the access to the basic coping resources that a community would provide. Now the incidence of depression and anxiety is absolutely off the charts among Gen Z. And it's not surprising that the most educated of Gen Z members and the most politically correct, the most intellectually gifted, suffer the most, much the same way as Ivan Karamazov did in Dostoevsky's best-known novel. Today, we're now at a crossroads. Will we somehow begin to deal with the insanity-inducing effects of technology, the isolating effects, or are we going to find a way to diminish our dependence on technology? And if we don't find a way to do that, I would say the insanity epidemic will become a global pandemic that will overshadow even the worst effects of the coronavirus pandemic.
Before I hand this over to Florian, I'm really interested you liken this to an insanity pandemic, Aleksey, because what if Alt Hess did a video on that like 3 months ago? So I thought that was interesting. Off to you, Florian. Whoa, I can't. Nobody can hear you, Florian. You might need to go to your settings. Okay, how about this? We're going to take this over to Keith, and then hopefully Florian can fix his sound.
Well, when we talk about the role of technology today in today's world, as a historian and sociologist by training and profession, I always like to relate this to past events that are comparable. What's happening right now is virtually identical to what happened in the 19th century with the rise of industrial technology. All of the same things were happening then that are happening now. You saw the breakdown of traditional social structures, which in those days would have been feudalism, and you saw the rise of what today would be called commercial society, bourgeois culture, things like that. And something similar is happening now with the digital revolution or the tech revolution. Like the digital revolution is to today what the industrial revolution was to the 19th century. And digital capitalism is the modern industrial capitalism. And the social effects of that are very similar. During the 19th century, you saw people moving away from rural areas to cities. You saw an explosive growth of cities. Cities reached an all-time high in terms of population. All the problems that you find in cities existed at the time and were often much worse because of the technological limitations of the time in part. The social breakdowns that took place fueled a whole lot of anomie, what Durkheim called anomie. In fact, if you look at the development of the field of sociology, it actually developed in response to the conditions of the 19th century. Auguste Comte was the first person to popularize the idea of sociology, and he was interested in applying what he thought were scientific principles to the study of society, largely because he was interested in examining the effects that the Industrial Revolution was having on European society at the time. And all the other people that were considered the founding fathers of sociology, like Emil Durkheim, like Karl Marx, like Max Weber, all of those were largely writing in response to the impact of the Industrial Revolution as well. But you had the same thing happening in terms of identity as well as technology and urbanization. You had people losing their traditional identities, based on social ranking, based on their place in the feudal order, based on their status as a peasant who was native to some particular village or town or something. And you had a lot of people starting to drift off into new ideologies and new philosophies. For one thing, the traditional religions were starting to lose influence. And as Nietzsche said, that you started to see the rise of these secular substitutes like nationalism and liberalism and socialism and communism. And we see that happening today as well. Today, we see not only the breakdown of traditional or what to modern people would be traditional communities in an economic sense, where we don't really have the towns that are industrial towns where people make their living working in local factories and things like that. Instead, more and more people are working in the gig economy. People are also a lot more transient and mobile than they used to be. People move multiple times throughout their lives to different cities and even different countries. People are much less likely to be acquainted with people who live around them. Like there's virtually nobody in my neighborhood who stays here longer than 2 years. If somebody's been here for maybe 3 or 4 years, they're one of the veterans. I've been here most of the last 37 years, so I'm like the senior citizen of the area. So people don't really have this kind of community-based identity based on friends and neighbors and that kind of stuff. People tend to live apart from their families, certainly their extended families, often in different cities, different states. So whether it's family, whether it's community, whether it's church or religion, whether it's all these other kinds of traditional identities, those things are breaking down, and people are finding new identities in these online subcultures. And we have the proliferation of all these cultures, like the gamers or all the political subcultures or all the more newfangled religions or recycling of old religions. All these kinds of things are happening in the same way that they were happening in the 19th century. I mean, if Karl Marx and Durkheim and Weber and those people were here, Auguste Comte, if they were here today, they could really have a field day analyzing what's going on in the world today, particularly in the United States, because I think these changes are the most pronounced in the United States when compared to many other parts of the world. But it's a virtual repeat of history. The digital revolution is the new industrial revolution with all the same kinds of effects. Breakdown of traditional community, removal of people from their traditional livelihoods in many ways, a loss of identity, and efforts by people to find new identities in all of these other things. And there's also the question of the impact of technology on the distribution of power. That's one thing we really haven't talked about yet. But one thing that societies of today have that past societies didn't is the ability to engage in things like surveillance. Like the police state dictators of, say, past times would have been thrilled to have the kind of surveillance power that you can have with modern technology. I mean, imagine if Stalin had closed circuit television and all of this kind of stuff. I mean, he would have thought that was the most awesome thing ever. So you also see this kind of surveillance technology that we have. You see the ability to trace individuals. It used to be, for example, if you were a fugitive, you could go hide somewhere and pretty much get away with it. Nowadays, it's a bit more difficult. They can trace your cell phone signal. They can trace your use of credit cards. They can trace your banking activities. They can trace your IP address. So you're, in many ways, you're much under the thumb of authority figures or institutions now than ever. Even if there are also advantages, obviously, to contemporary technology. For example, a lot of the type of work that I do, I wouldn't be able to do without contemporary technology. And there's a lot of other things I do I wouldn't be able to do with contemporary technology. So it's similar to industrial technology in that sense as well. Industrial technology had the effect of growing the size of the middle class, raising living standards in many ways, or raising life expectancy, reducing infant mortality, and a lot of things. There were a lot of positive benefits to industrial technology, other than just things like convenience, like having cars and airplanes and that kind of stuff. But it's also true that there was a cost associated with that. One was the destructiveness of modern warfare with industrial technology, and also modern societies tend to be more tightly regulated in other ways. That's what Weber was talking about when he talked about the iron cage, about how modern bureaucracies had created this iron cage that everybody is subordinated to. And so this is a repeat of the 19th century, early 20th century that we're going through right now with digital technology. So the issue that remains is, well, how far is that going to go, and what can we do to counter that? And I don't really have any idea.
Okay, Florian, how's your mic doing?
It's better now, I hope, huh? Can you hear me?
We got you.
Yes! I had to restart my entire computer. Such is technology nowadays, by the way. So I thought maybe I should give like
Florian, you're kind of loud. Could you turn down a little bit?
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Today, I thought maybe I bring like a short overview about what life in community-oriented like real life communities looks like. Just from my own upbringing in Germany. I grew up in a little village in Germany, in northern Germany, and that was in the 1980s. And I imagine it's probably Germany's 1980s is similar to American 1960s. And I still remember how I came home from. I was 8 years old, maybe. I came home from a play date, and then all of a sudden, like 4 people from the village stood in our house. They just stood in there. They just walked in there. I never seen them before. My mother was cool with it, and that the community was so close knit that people would just go in and out of other people's houses. Nobody locked the doors, and it's really true. If you hear that, it's not just like blah blah. People really did not lock their houses because it was a strong community, and that even the TV which was there was only used very very like specifically for certain TV show or the news, and that was it. The TV wasn't running all the time in the background, and people of course didn't have online opportunities to do things, so they had to associate in real life, right? So that's how community organization looked like, probably also what Robert Putnam described, right? So it's an entirely different organization of community from organizing via Discord servers in modern social media, for example, right? You really are present with your people all the time, and that is really completely gone right now. It may come back, but it's really not there. Now, there were of course some people in the village, in these communities, that would be thrilled with not having to be part of the community, right? So social media and technology also gives people the option of escapism, which some people don't want to be strung along in those community groups. And that was in the 1960s and 70s in the US, probably people that were seeing themselves more on the outside of society, right? So everything has a good and a bad side, right? What I found interesting is, so first of all, that I'm talking from a perspective where I clearly have grown up with community like that. And then there's technology. So as a Gen X person, I am able to use both, right? I know how to form normal connections with people, at least I hope. And so I also know how to use technology. And the early millennials still are the same, right? They also know how to do offline communities. But it's probably more of a problem for Gen Z and Generation Alpha, which is the next generation that's coming up, because they have never learned really to build these communities outside of the online world. So they really need to figure out what to do, because I think the urge to the urge to build communities, I think is something that's inherent in people. Humans want to associate with others, right? So people will figure it out. People figured it out in the past, as Keith said. There's, our time mirrors the Industrial Revolution, and people did figure out how to come together and form civic groups. So they will do that with the online revolution as well. How that exactly looks, I don't know, but I'm not pessimistic that these civic group formation will subside. I think that it will come back, but Gen Z has to figure out how to do that. Now, what Aleksey also said when he talked about the brother Karamazov, and it's interesting that they are also visited by Satan. If I look at Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, this is about a guy who is like a precocious kid everywhere and also tries to then figure out what holds the world together. And he's also visited by Satan and then goes on his own journey. And the book also raises the question, should we actually wish to explore and do research about our environment? Should we not just accept it the way that God has created it for us? And on his way, he becomes more isolated, Dr. Faustus, and also in a way more atomized, right? So there's also this spiritual aspect of community building versus atomization, right? Which I also find really interesting. And maybe based on that, all the civic-minded communities, they were inherently left-wing, right? And all the large left-wing movement, like for example feminism, you could also make the argument that those movements have also contributed to atomization, right? Especially feminism, who tries to individualize people and take women out of the social fabric of a family and give them independence. That of course also contributes to atomization. And we couldn't get a step further. The prevailing concept in the West of the nuclear family is completely anathema to like India, where you have multi-generational households. That is almost unknown. It used to be in the West. 100 years ago. It used to be that way how families were organized, but not anymore. And that also contributes to atomization. So the question is whether technology just exacerbates it or induces it itself. But I find it ironic that all the civically minded people actually, in the end, bought into some larger movement, which actually also contributed to atomization, right? In that way, modern technology is a blessing, because we now have the option to organize ourselves and actually counteract the atomization of society. And that is also something that Putnam brings up in his book and in the follow-up book. So he advocates for forming community groups to bring them together in real life, but that can also start online. So my opinion is that technology can be a threat and lead to more atomization of society, but it holds the tools that allows us to bond together and form more civic engagement again. And I think they all have to be followed up with some real life meeting, right? Just online, I think if you just meet online, you can form friendships that way, but if you really want to connect, you do need to visit each other in person. And the question is whether technology will allow for us to do that. When you look at several Discord servers that brings people together, for example, these people meet in real life, so the potential is there. And so I'm rather optimistic about the future. But atomization has been a problem, especially between the 1990s, which is when Putnam wrote the book, and into the 2010s, maybe up to 2015.
Yeah, so a few things here. On the one hand, given how earlier quote unquote iterations of technological society were obviously more authoritarian or constraining, whether it's the old socialist or fascist dictatorships or today's wokeism, the idea that this is all disintegrating is in one sense good, because it allows you to get out from underneath it and try something else. But On the other hand, there's broader trends which are negative. But before I get to that, the other thing, when you mentioned community life, Florian, I remember listening to an interview with Murray Bookchin about like how when he was young, he grew up and how he had all this community engagement. He focused mostly like on people meeting on each other's porches and talking way into the evening. And he's like, that was destroyed by modern consumer culture. And he's saying this like in the 80s. So that was kind of interesting. And you also mentioned multi-generational households. Well, I mean, as the economy goes down the crapper, that'll just have to become the norm again. Otherwise, people won't have children because it's just not a reasonable expectation to expect a man on his own to make enough money to buy a house anymore. It's just not a reasonable expectation. And if you keep having that as an expectation, then you just won't have any children. So the obvious alternative would be multi-generational households. But here's something that's interesting that both Aleksey said and Keith said. Aleksey, you said we have two choices. We can either lean more into technology or learn to distance ourselves from it. I mean, it exists. Unless you lead a Luddite revolution, you're not going to get rid of it entirely, at least not in the short term. But you can limit your exposure to it. You can limit how you deal with it. And Keith was saying that right now is a lot like the late 19th century. Well, in the late 19th century, we clearly leaned into technology. And if you're right, Aleksey, and I think you are, that a mental health crisis or a mental health pandemic is developing, I think that's partly why we had two world wars. The two world wars were sort of mental health pandemic that was the result of leaning further into technology. And you look at especially people writing after World War I, when they started developing theories of mass psychology, they were like, these people are collectively insane. And I think that's really interesting way of looking at the situation, because these people are all living in societies that are just leaning into exponential technological growth. And they didn't deal with it in a very healthy way. They certainly didn't distance themselves from it. And I think you could plausibly argue that if we continue to lean into it as we are, another world war is going to happen. And, that sort of seems like what the Biden administration is trying to do. So it is interesting that like we have this spurt of technological growth and optimism and then a world war. And it's like, those things are oddly juxtaposed, but I think it's because the narrative behind the technological growth is itself a false narrative and was only sold in order to get the growth going. And as you pointed out also, Keith, it led to increased lethality in warfare and increased social control by a small elite, which made totalitarianism possible. Right? We've had authoritarian regimes in the past, but we haven't had totalitarian. And the basic distinction is an authoritarian regime uses illiberal, coercive political methods to stay in power, but doesn't really do a whole lot else. Totalitarian regime is based on that, but then uses this to control every aspect of your life, which would just been completely impossible before modern technology. And at the time of the early totalitarian regimes, it would have been like the radio for communication and the machine gun for killing. And so those two things, and now today I guess that would be digital communications and drones. That would be like the modern version of that, which we see in China. And so the idea then is, are we, and I'll throw this to you first, Florian, or Aleksey rather, are we getting to a point where we lean into technology so much that we have a mental health epidemic, which then leads to a world war or a civil war in the case of Russia? So that's my question to you, Aleksey.
So I will start by framing the issue in terms of the nature of trade-offs with technology. And Dostoevsky is perhaps the most well-known novelist who discussed it from that perspective. In addition to the two works that I've mentioned, the Notes from the Underground and Brothers Karamazov, he also wrote a novel called The Devils, or The Possessed, which also emphasized the same point. There was a group of radical left-wing intellectuals whom he saw as being consumed by the collective insanity epidemic in his country. And what he was talking about specifically then was a group of anarchist syndicates who used terrorist methods to undermine the Tsar. Ivan Kalaev is the most famous of such terrorists who tried to assassinate Duke Sergei This is an example of technology, not technology, rather the vision of progress running amok. Now, what does this have to do with technology? Well, as Keith pointed out, in the Gilded Age, 19th century, we just began to get used to technology. And that we saw a lot of the same patterns here that we see today: enemy or social breakdown, a destruction of community as we know it, and a sense of being uprooted in society. Though I believe that although this is a valid observation, I think Keith seems to be confusing what Neil Hoff calls the second turning or the awakening and the fourth turning. They're similar in a lot of ways. Though in the second turning, the awakening, typically the emphasis is on increased individualism, opposition to machine-like politics. And this is what we saw in the second turning of the 19th century, the Gilded Age. And the generations Strauss and Hoff wrote about, the missionary generation, which were like the baby boomers, the idealists. Many of them were Luddites who protested the rise of technology, who were aware of its disastrous consequences and wanted to speak out against it. Now, fast forward this another 40 years, two more turnings, you get the fourth turning in the 1930s, which is far more reminiscent of where we are now. In the 1930s and the 40s, we saw the culmination point of the technological trends that began to take root in the 1880s and 1890s. This is when the World War happened. This was the prequel to the World War. So, Todd, I believe that your observation was characteristically perceptive. There certainly is a profound link between the mental health pandemic, which is largely technologically driven and reminiscent of the way Dostoevsky treats the concept of progress and the devil's notes from the Underground Brothers Karamazov and the World War. If there is ever a time where this could happen, this is now. We're now yet in another fourth turning. We are quite similar to the 1930s in the sense that now the society that we've been building for 80 years is actually coming apart entirely. We're now seeing calls for widespread reform of all sorts. This is different from the 1960s in many ways, and Keith repeatedly pointed out the similarity between Nixon and Trump, and that's true. The populist styles, the kind of riots that we saw out on the streets and the universities, but there was one critical difference. In the 60s and 70s, we saw riots against the repressive system. Students demanded free speech. They demanded to be free from the shackles of an oppressive centralized authority. Now we're seeing an opposite of this. We're seeing protests against free speech. We're seeing demands from both sides for a more controlling centralized government. For instance, many so-called progressives now want the Democrats to censor the right. They want to make it impossible for these conspiracy theories and the QAnon rhetoric to be circulated. They want the government to be more heavy-handed in defending Black Lives Matter. They want the government to be more heavy-handed at cracking down on people who are contrarians, who are not politically correct. And the right is not any different. The right wants Donald Trump to amp up his authoritarian rhetoric, but not only that, but to actually be a true authoritarian in ways that he may not be entirely open to being, no matter what he says. So this is one fundamental difference between the Gilded Age and the 60s and the present year. Now, back to your point, Todd, are we going to head into another war? It certainly seems that way based on a psychological analysis of the collective consciousness in the world. There has never been greater instability. There has never been a greater demand for dictators such as Viktor Orban, Vladimir Putin, what have you, AMLO, although he's not quite that authoritarian, Rodrigo Duterte. It's all there. And well, Keith, I know you've repeatedly made the argument that the world is really not becoming that much more authoritarian, if at all. Well, it depends on what countries you look at. In the US, we've become less democratic. In Europe, not so much, but there are just so many other countries that seem to be demanding for leaders to be more decisive, to be bolder in their execution of actions. One case in point would be Giorgia Meloni in Italy. While she's not an authoritarian, she certainly seems to be fielding the call. She seems to be responding to the demands for a more decisive leader. Now, we're seeing a little bit of that in Argentina. Milei, while he's not exactly an authoritarian, he certainly responds to the kind of demands for a strong leader who not only walks the talk, but actually is willing to go to extreme lengths to change his country. Is he a right-wing authoritarian, as some of his opponents may say? The jury is out on that. But to be sure, he's not an anarcho-capitalist and an entirely thoroughgoing libertarian who does not have a single violent bone in his body. Now, that is demonstrable nonsense. I would expect that with this generational turn that we're seeing, millennials are going to be more and more prominent in our society and culture. And millennials will be the dominant generation in 10 years. By 2030s, Neil Hoff predicts that we will be in the first turn, which is reminiscent of the 1940s. What can we expect? Well, millennials want more unity. Millennials want censorship. Millennials want to cancel people who think differently. And who founded Facebook? Well, a millennial. That is the crowning achievement of millennial entrepreneurship, if there is such a thing. Millennials are the least entrepreneurial generation for obvious reasons, as they're a collectivist cult. They're a collectivist generation, a civic generation, as Neil Howe and William Strauss characterized them. And as far as they are entrepreneurial, what they have created is the tech oligarchy and the tech dictatorship, which to me bears the closest resemblance to the Chinese social credit system that you'll find anywhere. And what can we foresee? Well, by the 2030s, I would imagine that the First Amendment will have fallen upon hard times. It may not be entirely repealed, but it will be certainly curtailed a great deal. And millennials will probably institute their own version of social credit, where the tech giants will track all your social media activity and assign you a score based on how politically correct you may or may not be. And this will determine whether you're eligible for certain jobs. In fact, it's already happening. Facebook and Google and the other platforms are already keeping track of people who are banned from Facebook for alleged hate speech. And then that definition is used very loosely and vaguely. If you say something negative about perhaps British tourists in Spain, as I did, yeah, I got banned for a few days. I'm sure I'm blacklisted already. And I don't think anybody in their right mind thinks it's unreasonable to criticize British drunks who keep on screaming all night about some TV show or soccer game they watched. A lot of local Spaniards are already tired of this, but Facebook sees this as hate speech. And now we're going to see, in 10 years down the road, we're going to see a culmination point. We're going to see a culmination point of millennial dominance in our culture, where the Americanized version of social credit will become a reality. Whatever you post, it may or may not be seen as politically incorrect or inappropriate, and this will be on your permanent record. And this will have far-reaching lifelong consequences for you. You want to join this meetup here for a career and networking opportunity? Well, if your social credit score is too low, well, you're not going to be allowed. The organizer will know about it, and you will be banned before you can even open your mouth because you tweeted something 15 years ago that may be construed as sexist, ableist, homophobic, transphobic, environmentally homophobic, and God knows what else. If you want to attend this university now, who knows? Maybe you posted something on Instagram when you were 14 years of age, and you can't get into this university because who knows? Maybe you posted a picture of yourself with somebody was just not so woke. Well. So is this going to lead to a world war? I don't know, but it seems like everything points in that direction. Have the tensions between global powers been higher since the Cuban Missile Crisis, or even since the 1930s? I'd say, if anything, they're much worse than the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, this to me is the contrast between the second turn that we saw in the 60s, the awakening, and the fourth turn, a time when humanity could never be at any greater peril, at a time when world wars are fought and civil wars are fought with lethal outcomes and are more likely to happen. So really the situation is substantially more extreme than it was in the 60s, and we're in the 1930s. If there is ever an analog that makes more sense, it's now far more possible.
Okay, Keith. So the same question to you: do you believe that the enemy of this, let's say the late 20th century, will lead to a world war in the early 21st, which due to the mental health crisis?
Well, I'm probably a little bit more skeptical of that. As far as the fourth turning model, the four turnings model that Aleksey uses, which I think is really interesting, I think I could offer a somewhat different application of that same model. If we look at how that model has been applied by the people who developed it, Strauss and Howe, relevant to, say, American history, the different fourth turning crisis periods. Well, let's see, the last one was the Great Depression in World War II, and then the one before that was the U.S. Civil War of the 1860s. And according to Strauss and Howe, we are currently in the fourth turning. What the Civil War was to the 19th century, what the Great Depression and Civil War were to the 20th century, to the early 21st century. According to Strauss and Howe, the comparable events would be the Great Recession of 2008, the COVID pandemic and the related recession, and the Russo-Ukrainian war. And I suppose we could add to that the current war in Gaza, given America's role in that. So by that analytical framework, we're already in the fourth turning. Now, earlier I was making an analogy to the Gilded Age, but I think that the appropriate analogy there is we're more or less in the early stages of the Gilded Age. Like the era of the Gilded Age, or what became the Gilded Age, that I would draw a contemporary analogy to would be its early period. The 1860s, for example, in the aftermath of the Civil War, when it was really just starting to become seriously noticeable and a serious public issue, even if it had been building up for a while. And meaning that I think that the Gilded Age parallels that we have now are probably going to get a lot worse before they get any better. Another parallel is to Reconstruction. There's a book that came out a few years ago called The Age of Acrimony, and that's talking about the United States in the post-Civil War era, Reconstruction and beyond, when there was a lot of acrimony in the United States. And but we have to remember that the Gilded Age and Reconstruction were both considered first turnings. They were not considered fourth turnings. And if anything, I think what we're seeing now, using this Strauss and Howe model, is the beginning of a first turning in some ways, or at least we see the signs of the beginning of a first turning, where this new Gilded Age generated by globalization and neoliberalism and the tech revolution is just now starting to emerge as a dominant factor in our society that people are taking notice of. And the parallel acrimony that we see in the wider society over politics, the fans of Donald Trump versus the woke left and all of this kind of stuff, is probably closer in analogy to Reconstruction or to the Age of Acrimony than it is to the actual Civil War. So it may be that the fourth turning crises are in the process of being played out, and that we're starting to see an inkling of what the next first turning is going to be, which is going to be the new Gilded Age, where economic battles become central in ways that they haven't been in more recent times. But at the same time, where the wider political acrimony that we see now, and it shows no sign of abatement, is going to continue. As for whether there's a world war, I can't say that's not going to happen, because right now is very similar to the era before World War I. I would draw a lot more parallels between the era before World War I and now than I would say the Cuban Missile Crisis or World War II or any of that stuff. Because what we see is the world is being fractured into multipolar powers, and we know what happened the last time the world was fractured into multipolar powers. So, although that remains to be seen, I wouldn't be willing to bet money that there's going to be a world war. And then there's a parallel question to that, though: is there going to be another civil war? Some people say, yeah, increasingly I'm seeing articles in mainstream media about the possible another civil war, possible breakup of the United States or something like that. I'm inclined to think that the wave of the future in the United States is going to be something more like the late 19th century, where you had lots of economic battles, you had lots of labor uprisings, conflicts between labor and management, essentially class struggle going on. And I don't know that the next wave of class struggle, or whatever you want to call it, is going to necessarily mirror what happened in the 19th century. But I do think economic conflict is going to become much more pervasive in the future. And I also think that we're going to have another age of acrimony that's going to endure for quite some time. And both of these, and the age of acrimony is not going to be just economic. It's going to be cultural, political, theological, whatever. And as far as the prospect of violence, I suspect there will be an increase in violence in the future. But I don't necessarily think it's going to be like the U.S. Civil War. I think it'll be more like the era of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. I mean, there'll be a lot of violence, politically motivated and otherwise. But it won't be something where the entire civil society breaks down. Like I calculated once that during the time of the Troubles, it was the relative to population size, it was the equivalent of 100,000 people a year getting killed in political violence. Now, imagine if in the United States we had 100,000 people a year killed in political violence. That's roughly the same number of people who die of drug overdoses on an annual basis in the United States right now. So we could easily envision a future United States where 100,000 people, the equivalent of the number who die of ODs, 100,000 people a year are killed in political battles, but it wouldn't necessarily be a breakdown of civil society. Most people would still have jobs, go to work, do normal life activities. It would just be the equivalent of living in a society with a high crime rate. And I think that is probably a more likely model of what's going to happen in the future. I think we'll continue to see all the acrimony we have now, and it may get worse. It may get more violent. We'll continue to see socioeconomic polarization, and that'll get worse, and that may be violent as well. And that in turn would be the equivalent of another first turning. The first turning after the U.S. Civil War, the time of Reconstruction and the Gilded Age. That seems to be the most analogous type of first turning model we seem to be moving towards. Of course, we could still have a world war or something before this fourth turning phase is over. But it may be that we've already experienced all we're going to experience there, or at least nothing worse than what we've experienced with the Great Recession, the pandemic, and some of the wars that are going on now.
All right, Florian, same question to you.
Yeah, I think looking forward, I agree with what Keith said. I think I think that technology has been a very positive force when it comes to the potential of wars. Yeah, we still see wars, but it's unthinkable to me that imagine George W. Bush wanted to start Iraq War II now. It would be considerably more difficult for him because thanks to social media, thanks to Twitter and other platforms, he would not be able to lie just bold-faced and get people to cheer for a war. That would not be possible. I think, there is a generation conflict coming that will be extremely strong. With the if the first turning happens in 2028, then the next generation Alpha will be at extreme disagreement with their parents, and they will probably be more entrepreneurial. They will not be as civic minded as the millennials, and we have something that we never had before, which is an anonymized currency with cryptocurrency, right? Bitcoin, Ethereum, all these currencies. That puts an interesting component to economic development, right? Because you have basically a generation that grew up with crypto. They could basically take themselves out of any economic normal woes, and have their own life by using cryptocurrencies instead. That's one possibility that I can see. So I think I would agree with Keith in saying that we're probably off the fourth turning, at the waning end of the fourth turning, as Alexei pointed out, that that even Howe has you know reformed his opinion and thinks the first turning should be starting in 2028, and yeah, I see that too. So I'm carefully or gently optimistic for the future. I don't think we'll have a big world war. I think that we have the brunt of the wars and crises behind us.
Okay, so to wrap up, we'll just go for this. So you said we have two choices, Alexei: lean into technology or decouple. And what do we think are people going to do? I think, and we'll just do around the table. I think they're going to lean in, and it's probably not going to be good. So, okay, Alexei, what do you think people are going to do in the future of those two choices?
They'll absolutely lean in, but I'm thinking they might find a way to do this in a more socially productive manner, which is why we need to raise the awareness of the disastrous ways in which technology is corrupting our youth with this insanity epidemic that foists upon them.
All right, Keith, you think people are going to lean in or decouple?
Oh, definitely lean in. I mean, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. I do think that Aleksey is right, that people may find ways of dealing with it in a way that becomes pro-social. There's a book on that I would recommend called The Network State by a guy named Balaji Srinivasan, where he talks about the possibility of using technology to create meat space communities that exist in the future as sort of rejuvenated human communities.
All right, Florian, same question to you.
Yeah, I agree with Keith. I would even see it as like a two-pronged. One generation will lean in, like the millennials and older, and the next generation will sort of lean out, because the network state, yeah, it's more technology, but the network state gives people an option to lean out of civic mindedness, like all the togetherness and all this, and form their own way. So in a way, I would see that as leaning out, using the tools you have, while the millennials and Gen Z probably also will lean in more strongly.
Now, before we wrap this up, I want to make reference to support that I got in a video that I did 2 days ago, but didn't notice because it came through right as I closed out Thursday's video. It was a super sticker for 1999 by Frederick 1483. Didn't get to thank him then. I just wanted to thank him now. Thank you for that. This is Todd Lewis. Thank you, Alexei, Keith, and Florian. It's always a pleasure. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Flight podcast, signing off.